Hi everyone. My name is Hana Morgenstern. I am Associate Professor of Middle East and Postcolonial Literature at Cambridge University. I'm really happy to welcome you to this piece of the series of Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance. This series is a monthly webinar that focuses on the study of literatures that have been shaped by histories of territorial and linguistic politics, colonialism, military domination, and human rights violations. The initiative at large grapples with the constructed nature of history, reimagines American and global history from the position of suppressed voices, and looks at how minoritized writers and scholars have historically innovated literary production and theory in the process of responding to systemic violence. Literatures of Annihilation is sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and by Cambridge University's Archives of the Disappeared Initiative. And this event is also sponsored by the Cambridge Faculty of English Postcolonial Program. So I'm really thrilled to be hosting a poet, intellectual, scholar, archivist, activist whose work has had such a profound influence on my own work, and has been really important and groundbreaking for any of us who study Palestinian literature, Mizrahi literature, Arab Jewish identities, histories, and cultures, and the relationship between poetics, histories, and archives. Ammiel Alcalay is a poet, he's a novelist, translator, critic. He teaches at Queens College in the Graduate Center, CUNY. His books include After Jews and Arabs, Memories of Our Future, Islanders, Neither Wit Nor Gold, From Then, From the Warring Factions, and A Little History. Recent books include the co-edited A Dove in Flight, poems by Faraj, sorry, how do you say it last name? Bayrakdar, yeah, with Shareah Taleghani and the New York Translation Collective. A poem sequence, Ghost Talk, and a bibliography for After Jews and Arabs. He has written and been active on the question of Palestine for decades, and during the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, he was one of the main conduits for translations from Bosnia. He's also a contributing editor of the Markaz Review and was given a 2017 American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation for his work as founder and general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative. Ammiel, welcome, and we're very happy to have you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks. There's just a few things I want to say before I start the reading part of my program, which will be in segments. But this originally was supposed to be a conversation between me and Sanallah Ibrahim, which I had been looking forward to enormously, and actually spent a good part of the summer rereading all of Sanallah's work. But for a variety of reasons, he couldn't make it. So I hope that we'll be able to do that maybe next year or some other time. So I just wanted to mention that. The other thing that looms is this has been a very hard week for many of us, me particularly, with the death of Etel Adnan and Jimmy Durham, the artist Jimmy Durham, both of whom were, Etel and Jimmy were beacons to me, to my thinking. Etel was a very dear friend who I believe I probably met sometime in the 1980s of the previous century. And Jimmy I also met in the early 90s, although I'd been familiar with both of their work prior to that. So if you don't know their work, I'm sure many of you do know Etel's work, but if you don't know their work, seek it out. They were very extraordinary people, very extraordinary artists, and I have found them companions for a very long time in everything I think about and conceive. So I'm going to start my reading with a section from the Cairo Notebooks, which came out in 1993. And that is a book that actually Etel had written an extraordinary little text that we used part of as a blurb, and maybe I'll read that later. The atmosphere of this is the first Intifada in Palestine, and the relationship to Iraq. Yeah, I guess that's how I would put it. I lost the Cairo notebook in Geneva. It had checkered lines and the word yellow was written in red letters. Here, in the whirlpool of the city, in the incessant noise of masses of refugees and exiles from different lands and of different races, among sad displaced peasants in broad blue gowns who had left a homeland not their own to oppressors and blood-sucking landlords, to escape empty-handed to the distant and enchanting city of promise and to try their fortune there as porters and street cleaners, doormen and pickpockets. Here, his presence aroused no wonder or astonishment. To burn the house down with the money in it, to revel in the power of refusing to loot, to strip the soldier of his clothes, put his weapons on the pyre and let him go free, ashamed of his nakedness. Many dozens showed up in the mosques and swore on the Quran that they had abandoned their treasonous ways and were then reaccepted into their communities. The press reported cases in which weapons, which were brought by the collaborators, were not taken for use by the uprisers, but were publicly destroyed as a symbolic act of purification by means of total separation from items contaminated by the occupation forces. In the name of God, the merciful and compassionate, appeal, 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 appeal number 12, to our sacrificing people, to the mothers of the martyrs, and to the mothers of detainees and the injured. We want to assure the kings and rulers that we don't want their money because we're willing to starve and go naked, but will never kneel. Three shot and killed at a roadblock. Faisal in for another 6 months. His wife and daughter visit once a week. Not to mention, more these days, not just Gaza. Army spokesman assure, 4 dead the day before yesterday, 5 more yesterday, 16 wounded. Names? Helicopters tear gas hospital compound to disperse family members trying to seize corpse for burial. Blood donations not acceptable. More or less presentable leaders. Creon forbid Antigone to bury her brother because of the demonstration that would follow. Solon, besides institutionalizing the distinction between good women and whores, legislated against ostentatious funerals to curb the power of the aristocracy. Not to mention the Trojan War. The nurses that we met from Sabra and Shatila, happy to be in Gaza. Some people at the vigil had relatives up there. The doctor was quoted as saying 6 people died and she amputated the legs of 7 others gunned down when they rushed to meet the food trucks trying to get in. After all the cats, dogs, mules, and other animals in the camp were eaten, a mother and her 5 children committed suicide to avoid having to turn to cannibalism. In Geneva, all the revolutionaries stayed in 5-star hotels. Tel Aviv, the Ayatollah floats over the central bus station. Textiles, cassettes, and tin. Posters of Saddam whirl and spin over the River Jordan. Mine eyes have seen the glory. That's that section. So Hannah, I'm not sure if you want to come in with a question at this point.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask you sort of 2 things about this section. So I'm really aware of the fact that this was actually like one of your earliest books of poetry, if that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what was the site that you were situated in that kind of produced this writing, and how are you kind of thinking about, also like sort of apropos the title of this event, like the relationship between documentation and poetry here?
Well, I was living in Jerusalem for off and on for 8 years in late 70s and then from 1984 to late 89. And I was very involved in, a lot of movements related to the First Intifada and related to things that were going on. And I also was doing a lot of translating documentation, of different things and collecting material. And although this book came out in 1993, the writing really dates from the mid 80s into like 1990 or so. And I guess something that has always, that I've been concerned with for a very long time is the integration of documentation and experience, and how to how to work through that. In other words, I think, in many ways, I this is a little bit of going ahead of it to the next reading, but I feel as if I lived through the end of the effectiveness of print journalism. Okay, mm-hmm. And the certain kinds of particular pressures that could bring to bear on situations. And so in some ways, there are parts of this that are, journalism by other means, or history by other means, or, as one of my heroes, Ed Sanders, says, they're putting poetry back to its original role, which is as a document of history. And that is really, in many ways, how I think of it. And also, it's also a history of my own positioning in relation to these things. And so it's very prismatic. I'm continually turning the prism to see. If you'll notice, in 5 or 6 of my books, there are whole paragraphs, poems that are exactly the same. The things that I've carried through to see what happens to them, to put them in different contexts. And so the use of documentary material has been something I've, even if at an earlier stage it had been poetic material, like I use the Roman form or of just using lines from different poems to create poems. That's also documentary, that's also a documentary method. So here it just happens to be with materials from particular situations, some of which there's whole sections here that are that have to do with documentation of cases of torture, and trying to figure out how to use that in a way in which I can offset the narrator so that this enact the differences, without commenting on them, enact the differences in positions that the narrator is in, that the subject is in, and those kinds of things. And in addition, I would just say that, much of this also has been I feel that writing is a collective endeavor. And so, if somebody, the poet Ed Dorn, who's another great light of mine, talked about when you look at a whole field of writing and you see what is being done, you don't need to repeat what somebody else may be doing better. And so, in the U.S. scene, in American English, particularly at this time, I felt there was an enormous absence of confrontation with this kind of material. So some of this work is also very challenging to American writers, particularly at the times that it was written, and I hope continues to be. And so that's also part of the impulse there.
Thanks. I guess I was also wondering, your book After Jews and Arabs, which deals with this kind of sort of flexible genre historical and cultural history of Arab Jewish culture and presence and philosophy, is published 1 year before. And I was wondering, were you writing them at the same time?
Yeah,
did they have a connection to each other?
Totally. The After Jews and Arabs could not have been written without the material that's in the Cairo Notebooks, and vice versa. In other words, they're completely informed by each other. I think the reason why After Jews and Arabs met, besides obvious reasons, met so much resistance at the beginning. That was finished in 1989. It didn't get published till 1993, and it was basically suppressed by readers for whom, it made them nervous because they would have to retrain if the thing was accepted. And I mean, that's what it boils down to, really. I mean, it's just, and so I think one of the things that really made people nervous, besides the scope of the thing and the whole redefinition of Europe and, removing that history of the Jews in that part of the world from modernization and putting it in the context more, of colonialism and of empire. But besides that, the particular politics of it, which was completely informed by anti-Zionism, by the First Intifada, by the class position and cultural position of Mizrahi Jews, and all of that, made people extremely nervous, because that stuff hadn't been put together in quite that way. And so, without having worked in the positions that I worked in, without having, been the rapporteur for Faisal Husseini, going in and out of prison, without working on things with the Alternative Information Center about sea piracy and torture, the density and the clarity of After Jews and Arabs would never have reached that point. It's they're completely informed by each other.
Yeah, and since then there's really been like a kind of revolution in that whole field of scholarship, right? I think like even 10 years ago, I remember there being a conference about After Jews and Arabs and the way in which it's kind of revolutionized the field of study. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, and also the bibliography that just came out.
Sure. Well, it's strange because as I slowly withdrew from that work, it was carried on by a lot of people, you amongst them, but many younger scholars. And, and in a sense, in the last couple of years, I've come back around a little bit, for a variety of reasons, and reintegrated into how I'm thinking. And, clearly, I mean, it wasn't the only thing, but there were other texts that definitely had an impact, at the time. Ella Shohat's work, and other people who declared certain things, and in many ways that struggle is much harder in the U.S. It's much more entrenched. So, for instance, when I did Keys to the Garden, which was the anthology of Mizrahi Jewish writing, at that time there were 24 writers in the anthology. I think 22 were alive at the time I finished it. Only about a third of those people knew of a third of the other people in the anthology, meaning that those people were sometimes living in the same city, and they had sometimes some people knew the names of other people, but they thought they were like political activists. They didn't know they were poets or novelists. They just knew them like by recognition, So that book had a much greater impact on the development of stuff in Hebrew than it did in English, which was very interesting. I thought, okay, maybe this will help move things a little bit. Not at all. I think 2 or 3 translations came out of that whole book. There was a book that I co-translated with Oz Shelach by Shimon Balas, a novel. There was the work of Samir Nakash that a translator by the name of Sadok Masliach had been working on for years. And thankfully, good friend Sinan Antun, who's here, is also working on Samir. And that was about it. There may have been 1 or 2 other things. So it fell flat completely. And I've been very interested in examining why Mizrahi Jewish literature, with all the abundance and efflorescence of, identity politics and quote unquote minority literatures, it's like it hits a stone wall. It's very, very hard to get through. And it's a really interesting case. It's partially, we've talked about this, it's like too complex for most, there's too many layers. Shimon Balas's book that we translated called Outcast, it begins with a whole fiction, which is that the book is narrated from the point of view of a Jew who was converted to Islam, and it begins with him getting a medal from Saddam Hussein. Now, none of this is really stated, but it's just this guy who's narrating this thing is very nervous about, did he forget his glasses, or, is he going to screw up he has a thing written, and you begin to realize, of course, he's terrified if he fucks anything up, it's curtains, and but the hallways and vestibules that you need to go through just to get to the parameters of that text. Okay, Jew converted to Islam. The book is written in Hebrew originally, but it's imagined in Arabic. It just gets very, very complex. And I think there's no context for people to think about that in or with.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of context in the kind of Anglophone English speaking world of thinking about the complexity of Middle East identities anyway, complexity of Arab identities. And I think it just hits upon the kind of very narrow limits of what's legible to a kind of American audience. But go ahead and read your next segment. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is a complicated book, From the Warring Factions, which is dedicated to the Bosnian town of Srebrenica, in which there was an enormous massacre of Muslim boys and men. And the book deals with many different layers of things. It deals with the materials of recording historical events. So film is an underlying question. Native America, Indigenous America is an underlying question. Iraq is an underlying question. The Roman Empire and the American Empire are underlying questions. Anyways, I'll read just a few pieces from section 5, which is called Night of Unity, which is an allusion to a ceremony that the son of Maimonides, who kind of became a Sufi, instituted in and it's still a few communities that still participate in that ceremony. Night of Unity, Laylat al-Tahid, begins with 2 quotes. It had long been the position of the United States that the warring parties could work out their own alliances. National Security Advisor Anthony Lake to Ambassador of Bosnia-Herzegovina to the United States, Sven Alcalay, November 30th, 1994. Rise, shining martyrs over the multitudes for the season of migration between earth and heaven. John Wieners. We swam the submerged body all the way to the boat before hoisting it on deck. We were fully dressed. The book is a kind of a dirge. The king is talking about his death. Every time I read the book, I feel for the king. What is interesting and appealing to me is how you slow down the pace, how you use quotations as a model of reflection, a slow motion historical record, weighted and measured, where the isolated citations act as characters. They're cool and concise, as if part of the written record. At the same time, they're ethereal, as if outside the record, as if they are from the warring factions, past, present, and future, come to address us about the history they've witnessed. We stick with the plan, Mr. Thomas said. We insist that the map be accepted. He added that rumors about the plans being changed were untrue. One former director said gleaning facts from the avalanche of information was like trying to take a drink of water from a fire hose. The cover of the novel says only that it is, quote, by its author, unquote. It was just 8 years after the end of World War II, which left American journalists with a sense of national interest framed by 6 years of confrontation between the Allies and the Axis. The front pages of Western newspapers were dominated by articles about the new global confrontation with the Soviet Union, about Moscow's prowess in developing nuclear weapons, and about congressional allegations of red influences in Washington. Tribes, guilds, and mystic orders lost cohesion or disintegrated. Vast masses of people moved from the country and provincial towns to the big cities to enroll in the new army, bureaucracy, or police force, or to find employment in the new businesses that supplied the needs of these institutions, or to swell the ranks of the unskilled laborers and noticeably depress their earnings. Old ties, loyalties, and concepts were undermined, eroded, or swept away. Lost to history, the subject of fierce debate. The operation's success was mostly a matter of chance. One by one, participants retired or died without revealing key details, and the agency set a number of records of the operation. Its first successful overthrow of a foreign government had been destroyed. I wanted to let Friedman know that I knew there had been involvement in the coup, but that I hadn't written about it, he said. I expected him to say, "Jump on that story," but there was no response. He makes the proper sacrifices and advances to the scales of justice. There he sees his own heart weighed against the ostrich feather of truth. Let this cave be Egypt. The sentence, if this throne has a language, kinetoscope reels, the X-ray, the wireless telegraph, the mystery of radium, dazzling as the wheels of Ezekiel, the sword like a stream of light, the moth that burns its wings in the lamp. He says there is no substitute for time, the shadow it throws upon the screen. It is a crude mind that would insist these appearances are not real, that the eye does not see them when all eyes behold them. They go to film after film till the whole world seems to turn on a reel. The reel now before us survives the shrinking and the warping, the chapters on coming forth by day, mysterious fourth dimension of its grace and glory. Half lies, half truths. The writer took poetic license. Poetic license, he says, drives me crazy. The field was filled with white specks, and from a distance they looked like mushrooms. But when you moved up closer, you realized they were all skulls. If we want to talk about things, I left my mattress cover, I left my pillow, I left my plate and my cup, I left the clothing that I wore, I left everything and nothing. These people down here, this is like an echo chamber. It's an echo chamber that resonates with the testimony of the living witnesses. And these people, these dead people, are telling us the same story that the living witnesses have told us. Many people march toward the strange, glorifying eye of the camera, growing larger, filling the entire field of vision, disappearing when they are almost upon us. Imagine a production that would chronicle the promise, as a method of keeping the story from ending with the white glare of the empty screen, darkness on which we can paint the feeling of return, the question of our departure. That's that.
Thank you. So I had kind of a similar question here about this work. Just if you could talk a little bit about like the context of your work in Bosnia and like where you were when you wrote this and how that influenced how the kind of situatedness of your work influenced the kind of the poetics of this book.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, I was the only translator really in the US who was translating material from Bosnia for the first at least 2 years of the war. Literally, I was the only, and so I was in immediate contact. I was mainly in Croatia over the summers, generally during that period, and I did go into Bosnia a couple of times, but sitting in Brooklyn, you know, I was. It's hard to even, describe at this point because it seems so crazy. But you know, I began by translating the fax. There were faxes then, fax machine. I would get, I remember the first item that I got was an account from that somebody had given to a journalist about a village being overrun, and I get this account on this fax, and I wasn't really, I didn't really know exactly what to do with it. But what I want to say before I go into the question is that in the case of Bosnia, I feel which is very different than Palestine at the time, 1980s, even somewhat into the 90s. There were a group of people that I call image makers, which are writers, journalists, filmmakers, artists, photographers, etc., who had personal relationships. People, we knew each other, and so when the war started in Bosnia, and even prior to it, people were in touch with each other, and there was a very immediate and fluid movement and communication. And so we presented an initial blockade against propaganda that was quite effective, and it's pretty remarkable what kinds of things were able to be done during that period, even under the blockade, but again, I was sitting there and receiving this material and then trying to figure out what to do with it, how to place it. And that eventually worked into, I translated a variety of materials. I translated direct witness accounts. I translated mainly journalism, particularly from one journalist, Zlatko Dizdarevic. And I did, I think, 3 of Zlatko's books. I did a bunch of columns that were which was remarkable. I did them for Time magazine. And when we were working on those, they said, well, we don't know what to pay you because we never really did this before, where we have a foreign journalist with a guest column, basically, and that was very crazy work because I would get this text, if I could get it by some means, fax or something, usually in the evening, and the thing would be due in the morning, so there was all of that going on. At the same time, I'd been interested in and reading Bosnian and what was then Yugoslavian literature, and had also translated stuff from starting in the early 80s. And again, I found it was impossible to get anything Bosnian translated. Nobody could figure it out. Nobody was, and then while the war was going on, I have probably one of the better collections of material that was published because people sent me stuff. People sent me whatever was being published. It came to me. And in figuring out what to translate, I did not want to be the person who swooped in and decided I'm going to translate this. And, so I would ask friends, what do you think I should translate? What do you think? And I encountered this text, Sarajevo Blues by Samezdin Mehmedinovic, and people universally said, go for it. This expresses what we're thinking, and so that was the first literary book that came out of that experience. While there are other books of journalism, there was an account by a guy who happened to be a poet, but he'd also been in a camp, Reza Kukanovic, The 10th Circle of Hell. And that was, again, the ridiculous circumstance where I had that manuscript and it didn't have anything to do with Srebrenica, but after Srebrenica happened, all of a sudden everybody started, calling me, phone off the hook. We need, do you have that text? And it had nothing to do with it, but I had already had it ready for like a year prior. So, it was in some sense opportunistic, just jumping at whatever chance to get this material out. But it did, I think it was very effective. Now, at the same time, I was thinking, okay, how does one go about, because I'm somebody who's steeped in, I come from the tradition, you read Pound's Cantos, you read William Carlos Williams's Patterson, you read Charles Olson's Maximus, you read Alice Notley's The Descent of Alette. You think of a long poem. How does that work? How does that work in these circumstances? And so I struggled with that. I really thought of that. And I'm also, my greatest reading experience, I think one of my greatest reading experiences was as a tutorial with one other person reading Virgil's Aeneid in Latin, which I did at City College before I dropped out. So obviously Rome was on my mind. I had been dealing with a tremendous amount of documentary material, UN material, witness material, news, just trying to decode what was, how that whole thing was going on. Because, I don't think people understand exactly that Bosnia, the situation in Bosnia, while that was going on, it had been just preceded by what was going on in Algeria, number one, those horrific years in Algeria, and the Gulf War. And it is, the settlement in Bosnia is kind of a blueprint for human rights apartheid, and the NGOification of governmental structures, which removes any power from autonomous, which is happening globally. And so there was a lot to think about there. Now, in working on this text, I felt very strongly that I didn't need to say anything new. I needed to recycle the words and the materials that already existed. And so there are 5 sections of the book. Each one is like a different language climate. Book 3, for instance, is the book that deals with the actual events at Srebrenica. Book 4 only uses American words, okay? And there's a lot of words that I culled from true crime noir stuff, because I figured this is a crime, so what does that language look like? So I literally created word lists, like the way a painter would take a palette, and have colors. I created word lists, and I used strictly words that were on that list and composed, okay? So for instance, I'll read one poem that ends the Srebrenica section. The last 3 poems in the Srebrenica section, I drew language from Shelley's Revolt of Islam. Okay. Now, the only reason I went to that poem was because it was the only kind of canonical English text I could think of that had the word Islam in it in any prominent sense. And also that had been a renaming of that poem. I think it had a prior name. But I found, okay, what happens if Shelley's words are the words that are used to describe and confront this experience? Some very interesting stuff happens. So for instance, this is the last poem. These are all Shelley's words, okay? Suddenly, like shapes of living stone, clothed in the light of dreams, I tore the veil, the shrouds which wrap the world, the frost of death, the flood of tyranny, a paradise of flowers, within which the poor heart loves to keep the earnings of its toil. A common home, stains of inevitable crime, pride built upon oblivion to rule the ages that survive our remains, violence and wrong and unreturning stream, the grief of many graves, snow and rain on lifeless things. This is not faith or law, opinion more frail, or life poisoned in its wells that delights in ruin. As endless armies wind in sad procession, the earth springs like an eagle, even as the winds of autumn scatter gold in the dying flame. We learn to steep the bread of slavery in tears of woe. These faded eyes have survived the ruin wide and deep, which can no longer borrow from chance or change what will come within the homeless future. That gold should lose its power and thrones their glory, that love which none may bind be free to fill the world like light, whose will has power when all beside is gone. Faint accents far and lost to sense of outward things, some word which none here can gather. Yet the world has seen a type of peace, some sweet and moving scene returning to feed on us as worms devour those years, come and gone like the ship which bears me in this, the winter of the world. So, literary criticism, anyone? I mean, that becomes a very profound kind of encounter. Okay, Shelley and Srebrenica. How does that work? What happens? And so that the book is filled with those kind of things from, and it's very curious. I mean, I went through 2,000 or 3,000 pages of UN documentation. The language was unusable. I couldn't even find prepositions. I mean, it's just I couldn't use it, but I had to go through it to exhaust it and then to find language that I could use.
Yeah, it occurs to me that it's interesting that that segment is really beautiful. And I was just thinking when I was reading it yesterday again, that there's this sort of central you don't really think about it when you're in the book, but as you kind of go through the whole thing, that it's taking place in a dialogue between you and Diane de Prima and also Benjamin Hollander, and I was kind of like wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how those two poets, Diane de Prima, the beat poet, and Benjamin Hollander is kind of an anti-Zionist Jewish American poet, why those were the kind of framing conversations,
Well,
and then when you're done, feel free to just go into the next segment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, both Diane was, both were very dear friends, Diane and Ben. And the first edition of From the Warring Factions came out in 2002, and it just had the longish. It's called a dialogue. I call it a monologue, between me and Ben. And partially this was not partially, but the late Fred Dewey, who was another great friend, who was the editor of this, and who also conceptualized books as kind of toolkits. That the book should have these moving parts in it, and kind of one thing hinges on another. So he wanted to do this this conversation between me and Ben, and I think it's a valuable document. In many ways, I had to then write another book called Scrap Metal to kind of fill in the gaps, or shift the narrative of that conversation in some ways, because I felt it was very directed in some ways. Ben was the single most generous and intelligent reader I've still encountered. He was like from another planet. He had X-ray vision. He could get to the core of something very quickly. So he was a constant interlocutor. And actually, one of the passages in that thing that says how I use quotes, that's a quote from Ben. Okay, and when the book had gone out of print, and we were doing a second edition with Upset Press, who also published which I'll read a poem from, the Dove in Free Flight. We asked Diane to do the introduction, and I was flabbergasted, because I think Diane has done like 3 such introductions in her life. She just didn't do that kind of thing. And it's so, it's such a profound text. It's short, it's page and a half. It's such a profound text. It has so much resonance for me. But I guess I'm trying to grasp the second part of your question. I guess I mean constant. Everything is a dialogue. Everything is a
I guess I was
a gathering. The voices are in my head. These words are in my head. These people are in my head. And so there's a constant reverberation of things that's bouncing across, so that this book happens to be actually technically framed by these 2 people is extraordinary. So it kind of, so I'm in the middle here, and and of course my dedications are always have a little, carry a little resonance. This one being for Srebrenica, but I'm thinking of a little history, which is which I can't put my hands on now. But anyways, the point is that I see this work as it's a constant integration of relationships and of other people's work and responses to them, and yeah. So let me go on to, I'm going to read. I'm working on a thing. I'm going to read, I've got 2 more poetic segments, and I'm going to read from something that I'm working on now, which is called Palestine / When There Was Music. And actually there are 2 distinct parts to it. The Palestine is about Palestine and particular people. And When There Was Music is really about music and encounters with music and encounters with musicians. And I haven't quite figured out what their relationship is to, but this is from Palestine. Jamila. You told me about the pharmacy your family ran in the old city and what you remembered about the war in which your father was killed. We were sitting on your porch, your mother inside, drinking lemonade in the early evening. No one but us thought this was a good idea. Akram. It was in the afternoon, the sky was pink with sand, and we found you and you just joined us, walking on the walls of the old city, knowing you'd miss curfew. So I said, just stay with us. But we really couldn't all stay where I lived. So I said, let's drive. Let's just keep driving back and forth to Nazareth until the sun comes back up, and then we'll get you back home. But you told us not to worry, that you'd find a spot to sleep. But we didn't want to let you go, not because we thought they'd find you, but because we just so much loved having you with us. Hiyam. It must have been by phone back then that you gave me directions to come and visit you in Haifa, where, if I'm not mistaken, you were staying with an Englishman by the name of Michael. I took the bus from Jerusalem and walked the hilly streets until I got to your place, where I think we had lunch, though we might have gone out for a walk and sat someplace. It was almost impossible for me then to get away from the order I'd been put in, an order much older than I was, and crushing in ways I couldn't even imagine or articulate. But in the film I'm watching now, I hear you utter it exactly. You playing a mother speaking to her daughter, or your own older self, or maybe you, younger, speaking to someone you thought you might become. Your memories are as real as mine, you say as the mother, and your daughter says, the loss I feel was never mine, to which you reply, when our time comes, that time will no longer be ours. I remember the ease of our visit, the rhythm of the city, like a random night I'd spent in Rome once, as if I'd always lived there and never left. In Haifa, we spoke about Tahir Watar's The Earthquake, and I think you read some passages in Arabic. I'm present there now in the words the film asks you to speak, like Ibrahim's bird that speaks again. Dear Ibrahim, whom last I left on the outskirts of Edinburgh, awkwardly dropped off by a relative who couldn't recognize in him the very visage of ourselves, a soul so human he refused to pass through borders imposed by colonizers so as not to be infected by hatred of the intruders. And now, Hiyam, seeing you speak through a character in a film, I also understand why you left. Faisal al-Husseini, 1940-2001. At this distance of time, place, and circumstance, let it be known that I'm humbled and honored to have had the chance to wait for you in greeting in the halls of various prisons as you were brought out to us in shackles and leg chains. Your wife with a small comb and brush, your son and daughter holding close, and us waiting for the right moment to get a message about the kidnapped and disappeared you found out about, captured at sea on their way to the camps to bring food and medicine to their loved ones after religious authorities had approved the consumption of unclean flesh. And you, no matter what, no matter how long they made you wait, no matter how humiliating the circumstances, you, Faisal, always had a smile for us. So that is those. And, you know, as you can see, they're very, I don't know, it's almost like a Spoon River anthology of Palestine. They're vignettes, portraits, and I'm trying to be very clear in my memories, very, very graphic and very clear in my recording of those memories. And yeah.
Yeah, I thought I would kind of take this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about your relationship to Arabic and Hebrew, and kind of your role as specifically as like a translator, a literary translator in Israel and Palestine. And
sure.
And also, you know, maybe if you, I mean, feel free to ignore this part, but if you feel like reflecting a little bit on what the role of literary translators is under these kinds of colonial conditions.
Sure, sure. Well, you know, it's a complex question. First of all, I truly regret, you know, not really having lived for a longer time in an Arabic environment, because I, you know, at one point my Arabic was okay, and it's not okay anymore, which is really sad and difficult, in which I always, wherever I am, I have a stack of books, you know, grammars and readers, and I'm constantly struggling. When we worked on when Shareah and I did the final edits on Faraj's book, it was very good because I knew the poems very well, and I was able to, it was able to dredge up certain things, and so that's a big regret that I'm still working on. Hebrew, I immersed myself. I was very immersed in Hebrew. I did a lot of translation. I did a good portion of the translations in Keys to the Garden, and a bunch of other stuff. I think I have a very I have a complicated relationship to the idea of translation, because I think, in the US, there was a time when, there was this big hand wringing, we don't translate and blah, blah, blah. And it was like an NEA study and it's a disaster and this and that. And so a lot of great institutions popped up, like publishers that concentrated on translation and so forth. But I still feel translation in the US is still a huge problem, because for a number of reasons. Mostly there is I don't even like using this word, but reifying, reinscribing, I will say, a reinscribing of generic boundaries. So you have books of poetry, novels, you have very little of the detritus out of which a writer's life and thinking actually emerge. Polemics, letters, criticism, all these kinds of things. It's very hard to get those things translated. There's more of a push. Like obviously there's been some great, the recent anthology of Suf, Anfas, that was done by Teresa Villaignacio and Olivia Harrison, was wonderful, because it's like a context. You're getting a bigger context. Okay, Keys to the Garden was an attempt. I want a context. I had interviews with the writers. I had photographs, because most people don't think those people existed. I really insisted on photographs. I think in many ways I teach translation at Queen's College, and we have the MFA in creative writing and literary translation. The students are absolutely wonderful, and I, have done some amazing work. But I also feel people don't, I think it's really important also not to translate sometimes, to immerse oneself in a place, to be in a place, to really become part of that place, to become part of its cultural life, and to become an instigator in it, a factor in it, and it really transforms the way one can then think about translation in a wider, more institutional sense, where you have like a whole project in mind of a larger kind, that is strategic, because you can't, in the US, you have to be strategic. There's no, nobody's going to give you the keys to, go ahead and do this work. I mean, unless you have something like what Phil Kennedy is doing with the NYU library, where you have deep funding and you can do it, for a long period. That's a great project. That's an important project. But in the US also, it's highly unsystematic. There people jump the line constantly. Like somebody will, I mean, Sinan could articulate this a lot better than I can, but it's just very clear. For instance, I mean, let's take Iraq. Okay, so no Nazik al-Malaika, no Bulund al-Haidari, no, so you get this truncated version of somebody who emerges from a whole density of culture, and they're like this lone figure, the Iraqi poet, or whatever. And that constantly happens. And sometimes it happens to a very negative degree, where somebody really can whitewash their not so great reputation by being translated into English and suddenly becoming the dissident or the rebel type. So I'm very wary in many ways, and cautious, and really like to think through these projects. Now, this project, okay, this began in Elias Khoury's seminar at NYU on prison literature. And when we got Faraj's text, everybody just, was like, this is unbelievable, and I suggested let's collectively translate it. So those of us who were interested did that. And, you know, they're now all of them have just become, you know, wonderful, you know, Sinan obviously.
Sorry, Ammiel, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book you're holding? Because we can't, I don't think everyone can see it.
I will. Okay, this is a dove and I'll tell you, this is a Dove in Free Flight by Faraj Bayrakdar, who's a Syrian poet now living in Sweden, who was a political prisoner for 13 years, 7 months, and a number of days. We encountered this text in Elias's class and decided to translate it. And the participants included Sinan, Rebecca Johnson, Solin Nalbantian, Jeffrey Sachs, and Shareah Taleghani. Okay, all who have gone on to do really significant work in their fields. There was a basic manuscript of this ready in 2004. It included a preface by Elias, a long interview between Faraj and Muhammad Ali al-Attasi, which is one of the primary human rights documents I've ever encountered. It's something extraordinary, where Faraj talks about his relationship to his body in prison. It's absolutely amazing. So the book was slated to be published by Fred Dewey from Beyond Baroque, my friend who edited From the Warring Factions and A Little History. And in 2005, I was attacked by neocons. And the purpose of that attack was to throw suspicion on institutions that I was involved in. So a lot of places got defunded, including Fred and Beyond Baroque. So the publication was delayed and didn't happen. And so basically from 2006 until 2019, this manuscript got rejected by about a dozen publishers, even during the war in Syria. Okay, so I have something here in my in the intro. I just want to read one sentence from this intro. Okay. But even that old standby to pique US readership and literary interest, catastrophic war and civilian carnage did not suffice in this case. Without daring to make any comparisons, one cannot help but at least make the analogy. Faraj Bayrakdar was in prison roughly the same time it took to find a US publisher for his work. Beyond the particular circumstances of any one publisher, this process, we would hope, ought to be recognized for what it is, an alarming instance of public intellectual, artistic, and political erasure, and yet another way in which vital information, the actual lifeblood of a besieged but still breathing world, is withheld from the US public. So this was a very striking example of what is sought to be translated and what isn't, or what might cause a problem, or what is less legible, let's say, much less legible. And there are ways in which this book was very illegible to a lot of people, because these are poems written in prison, and they a lot of them are about, birds and palm trees and things that are not in prison. And so it takes a little bit of thought to try to figure out what's going on here. Let me read one poem, and then I'll finish with my last segment, and we can take some questions. Story. Once upon a time, Epoch, son of time, told me that fire is a guide, so make sure you've got enough for a long and rugged ride. Attempt night anyway, and if despair knocks the door upon you, no matter, rise up and write on the walls without explication or detail. Oh, master despair, tell your lord, the Sultan, that the cell is no narrower than his grave, that the cell is no shorter than his life. This, if the earth accepts his corpse, enclosed by footsteps and protected by forgetfulness. Palestine Division, April 1987. So that's from that. So I want to close with some things that I started working on in roughly 2015, and they're very irreverent. They're kind of bumper sticker-like poems that are also very short historical treatises, but they also are, I have a long commute. I live in New Hampshire and I work in New York, so I'm on the road a lot. And sometimes I subject myself to National Public Radio. And I learned the trick of being able to jot down enough words to keep something in mind while driving. So I've got a little notebook and kind of set up that I can get it in the middle of the steering wheel and make a few notes. Or sometimes pull over if it's in need of a phrase. And this is in homage to Ed Dorn, who also had a long commute at one point in his life and was doing this and promoted this idea for writing while driving. Dorn in the 1980s wrote some poems called Abhorrences, which were very similar. And it was very caustic poems that had a great influence on his dear friend, Amiri Baraka, who was also a friend. And Amiri ended up writing these things that he called not haikus, but lokus. So imperial abhorrences and other abominations. Well, you know what? Let me. I won't. It begins with. I'm going to read these. Okay. It begins with 3 quotes. Okay. There's imperial abhorrences and other abominations in homage to Edward Dorn. For a long time, I forgot how important you were to me, and it took even longer to remember. But nothing like that's going to happen again. Now, there are 3 quotes that preface the whole collection. First one is by Brooks Adams from 1919. For some years past, many symptoms seem not obscurely to indicate that we tend to sink into that chaos of democratic mediocrity, which Henry Adams likens to the ocean, where waters which have fallen to sea level are engulfed and no more can do useful work. In such an ocean, tempests are generated by the operations of usurers, and such tempests are apt to be stilled by massacres, such as have become to us familiar of late in countries like Armenia. Brooks Adams, 1919. First signs of the machine really destroying itself and people is the guided drone plane with the atom bomb warhead. Drone is the horror name, deeply named by mysterious high priests in the forums of the Pentagon glare. Jack Kerouac, 1952. The war, the empire. When the Goths came into Rome, they feared the senators were gods, old men, each resolutely throned at his own house door. When they finally come to Akron, Des Moines, White Plains, the nomads will laugh as they dismember us. Other nations watching will applaud. There will be no indifferent eye, nary a disinterested ear. We'll screech and cry. Philip Whalen, 1966. Consumer demand. If you think of the United States of America as one huge nostril, a very long arm, or even a voracious mouth, reaching down to the Andes and across the fields of Afghanistan, the golden triangle morphing into a shape even Euclid couldn't have imagined, then you're beginning to get the picture. In an 8-minute segment of The Takeaway about African refugees in Israel, hosted by Todd Zwillich on NPR, the word Palestinian wasn't mentioned once. I actually heard this. I was on Route 95. It was snowing. The Belt Road Initiative, a new radial tire? Roadside, R-O-A-D-C-I-D-E, Roadside, remarks on a recent decapitation. Who needs ISIS when you have self-driving trucks? Silk Road, one belt. Is that a pajama set? Howdy, Howda. Why look, way over yonder, Hill and Bill in modest desert garb atop a gold-plated camel. Yippee-yi-yay. Propaganda thought experiment number 262. Waiter, help, quick, there's a Russian in my soup. Propaganda thought experiment number 4867. Waiter, help, quick, there's a Russian in my soup. Propaganda thought experiment number 11767. Waiter, etc. Literary history number 43. To attend a US reception in his honor in 1945, Aimé Césaire had to use the service elevator. Khashoggi or Khashoggi? MSM, which ends the poem, of course, is mainstream media. Khashoggi or Khashoggi? From an American perspective, perhaps the most notable thing about the case of the Saudi journalist was that for 2 straight days, no matter where you turn, from NPR to Fox or CNN, they all pronounce his name Khashoggi. It was as if the NSA had installed a pronunciation chip into the collective mind of the MSM. Translation theory. Maybe some of these people who think they can translate Hafiz or Rumi freely without even knowing the language ought to try working Gitmo, like my friend Khalid, where he couldn't say a word someone else hadn't already said. London calling, too. After stories bemoaning the scourge of fake news in Singapore and the supposed rehabilitation of Stalin in Russia, we're told that some 10 million people in Yemen are on the verge of famine. Given the somber tone and lack of any further information, one can only conclude that these poor, hungry souls must have brought this calamity upon themselves. Leaders to come. Once the hologram is hardwired to the digital flow of virtual dough, all bets are off. Even though they terrorize people who've done them no harm, the rats are patriots. They don't sell planes to Saudis to bomb Yemenites or fiddle to the tune of Zionists. Every day on my way to work, I watch them in the subway getting bigger, smarter, hungrier, and a hell of a lot more industrious than most of us. No, I have no fear. When the rats come to power, they'll die alone, all on their own steam. March 23rd, 2019. Over the smoldering ruins, having forgotten or never even known of the achievement of Egyptian stonework in granite and diorite, honed absolutely flat and level to 1/1000th of an inch, the lizard men and surviving humanoids collectively paw over one of the 21st century's only artifacts, the highly redacted remains of, yes, the Mueller report. 9th Friday. More and more places everywhere look like the milk bar. What to do? It is to you, fearless Algerians, we must look. Exercise. Every day, try and imagine how far you are from Gaza. The Disposition Matrix, which was the drone kill list. The Disposition Matrix. We can't possibly kill everyone who wants to harm us, a senior administration official said. Why the fuck not? Coda. And this one has a commentary afterwards. A lot of the others have commentaries, but I haven't read those. But I will read this one. Coda, Los Angeles, May 30th, 2020. Police cruiser in flames at Fairfax and 3rd, hundreds milling around masked and unmasked, staring at a row of vandalized cop cars. So much for dry sand. Commentary. As protests over the killing of unarmed George Floyd at the hands of 3 Minneapolis police officers rage throughout the US and other parts of the world, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's distinctions between wet and dry sand remain notable. On May 30th, in an interview, he said, Los Angeles beaches will open up this week for exercise and active recreation only. In the wet sand, I guess, is a good way of thinking about it, not hanging out and tanning in the dry sand. In another statement made on June 10th, the distinction still held. I don't think we can afford people sitting, tanning in the dry areas of the sand, but the wet sand areas, if you need to get in there to swim, to surf, to get in there and make sure folks can walk or jog, that is something I hope we can earn again. That's it.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Okay, so I think we will now open it up to the audience for comments, questions, conversation. This is usually the moment in which I ask people if they feel like it or are inclined, if they could turn on their cameras, because that's usually nice for us conversants. So if you want to ask a question, you can feel free to raise your hand, or just if it's slow, you can come to turn your mic on.
Or type it into the chat.
Or you can type it into the chat. Thank you.
Anyways, I'll just say those abhorrences. What happened is I kind of get to the end. I mean, they're endless. One could just keep writing them, but the material is there, believe me. But I had maybe 60 or 70 of them, and you could read them in about 15 minutes, and it almost felt like a flip book, and I thought it needed something. So I started writing these commentaries, which became very labyrinthine and elaborate. And so I'm working on those to finish it off. But they're yeah, yeah, it seems like the right book for the times. It's also just like how to deal with the language of propaganda and plain language that comes at you. And it's just like, what did I just hear? Like, really? And throwing it back, just refusing it, just absolutely refusing it and throwing it back on its head.
I'll ask a question, help get us started. Thank you, Ammiel. That was just so lovely. And thank you, Hana, for moderating. I wanted to come back to a point you both made early on about how difficult it is for people in the American landscape to understand the complexity of Middle Eastern identities and how illegible the landscape is, and how so often, even in the literary world, literature written by people who have been in the Middle East in any kind of diplomatic capacity or military capacity gets privileged over the voices of writers from the region who are actually doing this kind of documentary poetics. I think it's a two-pronged question. One is, do you think that people have become more or less curious about understanding the complexities of Middle Eastern identities over the last 20 years in particular? And how do you respond to that erasure of writers from the region that, we're dealing with in mainstream platforms in particular?
It's a great question. My answer, I think, is going to be a little complicated. I think we have to start with the erasure of our own writers, okay? And that is a constant, nonstop process. I mentioned Amiri Baraka, who was a friend. The last, I don't know, at least 20 years of his life, he was very obsessed with recuperating the milieu and the writers that he had escaped from, okay, meaning the people that he had been with in the 1960s, late 50s, 1960s, before he went off and started the Black Arts movement with other people. And he talked about this constant process in the US of having to reestablish legitimacy. It's a constant process of having to reestablish legitimacy. We don't have a map of our own. I just assigned a bunch of, I'm teaching this course called Writing Lives into print this semester. And part of it is to get people to think about, what goes into a writing life. And so I suggested a bunch of different ideas. And each of them was particular. It was a time, it was a moment, it was a type of person. And I said, how come nobody has put all these together? So we have a map, so people aren't reading these discrete entities. So I think we also have to look at how the reception of the Middle East is also a replication of the reception of ourselves. So for instance, in the Lost and Found project, which we might have a chance to talk about, a wonderful grad student, Khalid Al-Hili, is working on a project of the Iraqi poet Sargon Bulos, and particularly working on Sargon's translations, because he lived in the Bay Area for roughly close to 20 years, I think. And he translated a lot of poets that are not yet, or only recently maybe are being studied in the US. I'm talking about people like Bob Kaufman or Robert Duncan or, a variety of other poets that remain unmainstreamed, let's say, in so many ways. So I think your question is very complex, and I think we have to look at it not simply as a, reception of another thing, but a projection of how we perceive ourselves as well, you know, so, you know, I don't think there's like, if you look at the history of the publication of translations of Arabic into American English, they start with some small press work. You know, somebody like Kamal Bulata, the late Kamal Bulata, who was a very dear friend, was a pioneer in translations. You know, he still his anthology of women poets is still the best one that exists, Women of the Fertile Crescent, that he did, published at that time. I think it was a reprint by Three Continents Press. So, you know, that being said, one can amass a very large library of really important texts, but most of them are very decontextualized, you know, and so it's a continual process problem, you know, of for instance, in the 1960s and even in the late 50s, there were a lot of books about Algeria translated in the US. Henri Alleg's The Question, you know, many books were available. You could put together a little library that would be illustrative of major debates at that time. All of them are out of print, except The Question, which had been brought back into print at some point. So things happen. The question is, how are they received? How are they contextualized? And to whom do they speak? You know, and for what purposes? So, yeah, I don't know if that's really an answer to your question, but maybe, you know, it's a part of a thought process. So,
yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree. I think we need a lot more context. I mean, that's part of the motivation behind this lecture series too, is to try to map, right? Kind of a map of people's literary and migration journeys and the ways in which they have been in conversation with one another, right? Either directly or indirectly across time and space. I am so curious about what you said, though, about the reception being a replication of the reception of ourselves. And I wondered if you could lean into that a little bit, or unpack it, because I both personally agree and disagree. I think that it's absolutely true. At the same time, our identities have constantly been mediated by war, intervention, imperialism. So it's such a complicated, like the degree of agency that we have in representing ourselves has been challenged so often and in so many different ways throughout time. And our ability to speak to one another, right, has also been disrupted. So I'm so curious to hear, more about that.
I'm thinking of that on a very practical, pragmatic basis. Like, for instance, take small magazines. Okay, so Faraj was originally imprisoned for a magazine that he and a few other students started called the Literary Notebooks. Okay. In, I believe, the late 1970s. Obviously, the group around Suf Anfas were arrested for the magazine that they began, which was literary political, obviously. Now, those magazines were gathering places for a variety of people, some of whom became more well-known, you know, and continued, others who disappeared. Okay, so similarly, one wants to investigate the ground out of which writers emerge. You want to investigate where they encounter each other first. There's some kind of a weird echo going on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if somebody's.
Oh, me.
Oh, okay. So I'm thinking of it just on that very particular level. Like, what is the terrain out of which people emerge? You know, what is the terrain of debate, of polemic, of encounter, relationship. Okay, for instance, it's a very interesting phenomenon where similar dates, fairly similar dates. I think it's somewhere in the mid '60s, I believe. There was a festival in which Fadwa Tukan, the older Palestinian poet, met with the younger poets like Sami al-Qasim and Mahmoud Darwish, etc. And there was a kind of thought, well, okay, this is going to be a generational issue. Not at all. Okay, a very similar meeting took place in the US in which Gwendolyn Brooks met with younger Black arts movement people. Same idea. There were instigatory ways in which they tried to split them apart. In the end, Gwendolyn Brooks ended up, turning down a contract with Harper and Row to publish with Broadside Press in Detroit, which was one of the Broadside and Lotus were the two really most important Black-owned and Black-run presses that publish mainly poetry. Okay, now those are both very important moments in tracing a literary history or a history of relationships. And those are things that may seem minor in the scheme of things, but they're very formative. Okay, so I'm thinking about those kinds of things that go unrecorded when we get this text, okay? And we don't really know, what were the circumstances under which this text emerged? Besides the things, all of the very important things that you mentioned, obviously, what is the political situation? What is the colonial situation? What is the, et cetera? Who is the person writing this? What is their position in relation to all of that stuff, and so on and so forth. But I think one has to go to really just the very basic ground level, okay, of writers tend to emerge out of relationships, okay, generally, You can even take the extreme case of an Emily Dickinson and say that, her work also emerged out of a decision to refuse certain relationships, okay. And I just think it's very important to figure out ways to trace that and think about it as a way of understanding how these things were made, if that makes sense. Has something happened here? Like, am I?
I think we have questions from Miriam and then Dorothy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Azarine.
My question, Ammiel, is that it seems that there's a double muting that goes on. It's not just cultural landscapes that are, invisible in some ways, but it's also the genre. Your work does not ghettoize poetry, right? It doesn't take the history out of poetry to kind of put it in a sentimental place. So all the elements of history are still available to you. That was something I think that Pound presented, that you could have a long poem with economics and politics and history in it, right? Long poem with history. So it seems to me that, Faraj spent more than 13 years in prison for things that he said, right? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in the United States, you can say anything you want, but as long as you're in the literary ghetto, as long as you're in the poetry ghetto, like let them mouth off over there, right? Because we don't have to listen to that because it's poetry, right? Mm-hmm. And so that seems to me a very tough issue to address. And I'm just wondering what you might say about that.
Sure. No, that's a great question. Juan Goiti Solo has a wonderful text about that difference of, state suppression versus indifference, I guess, and how writers have employed various strategies to create the tension that's needed to bring the similar kinds of issues to bear that state suppression would bring. okay, if that makes sense. It's not like you want to invite state suppression in, but, operating under those circumstances, obviously the stakes are very high. I think there are illustrative moments, in a little history I write about Amiri Baraka's Somebody Blew Up America, which in many ways reminds me very much of Mahmoud Darwish's Those Who Pass Between Fleeting Words, I think, which was a poem that was all of a sudden discussed in the Israeli parliament, because it seemed to have, it was interpreted as having an explicit political message, and it's very funny because this is a legislative body that would never have, discussed or thought of Mahmoud Darwish unless this poem appeared. And I think Darwish, being a master rhetorician, I think he wrote that also as a test balloon. Let me see what reaction this elicits. And I think that's very true with Amiri Baraka as well. And Somebody Blew Up America, I'm convinced, although he never said it explicitly, but I'm absolutely convinced that that poem had certain things in it in order to see, okay, what is going to elicit a reaction here? So you have a situation in which a poem becomes front page news, but, the air controllers being offline for 30 minutes during 9/11 is not an issue. It's not an issue. It's just, well, whatever, So the question of what power a speech act has, if it's a executive order from a president, if it's a political declaration which has an army standing behind it, or if it's a poem that declares something, okay? So what are those things that will, when suddenly poetry becomes relevant? And that was very clear in that case with Amiri Baraka, where he was suddenly on the news. I remember him being interviewed on like the 6 o'clock news, where he quoted both Keats and W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was very surreal to see this at a point when, things like yellow cake uranium were phrases that were being used in order to gin up war and to fight a war that ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people, destroying a country, creating birth defects over the course of generations, etc. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that I constantly grapple with. I don't think, in the case of my work, I think, it can handily be ignored because it doesn't, because it questions some of the criteria of what's more acceptable. Whether that would lead, I find myself more as a conduit for work that is coming out of more extreme situations, let's say. But that's not to say that many aspects of the situation we're in the US and many people in the US are not also extreme. It's simply a question of, what route does that get transmitted through? Does it get transmitted through pen world voices, which is a colonizing enterprise, or does it get transmitted through a means that we don't even know about? So much more to think about there. Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you. I think, do we have time for one more question? Okay, go ahead, Dorothy. And then we'll wrap up. You're muted, Dorothy. You're muted.
Thank you, Ammiel. This is tremendously stimulating, and I very much appreciate all the avenues that have been opened up here. And I was thinking about Darwish. I just pulled out Memory for Forgetfulness, and it's as an example of how rich it is with the kinds of things you're talking about. And I don't know if you could say a little bit more about that. I'm so interested about the value of and the responsibility of poets to contextualize, that I just would like to hear a little bit more about that in relation to Memory for Forgetfulness, possible.
Sure. Well, first of all, that is a great masterpiece of translation by Ibrahim Mohawi. And in one of the poems that I read, when I said Ibrahim, that's whom I was referring to. Both the mode by which he translates that is which he refuses to simplify anything. There are parts of that text that are, I guess I would say in translation, maybe one of the most difficult things to do is to allow the ununderstandable to remain so. It's an extremely difficult thing to do, not to over subjugate the text to some mode of understanding. And so Ibrahim really allows that to happen. He allows the long sentences to remain as they are. He allows things to meander in ways that might not be completely clear. And his presentation is stellar. It's just it's absolutely stellar as far as contextualization. That is an extraordinary, powerful text. I'll just focus on one moment in that text, which is, again, one of those things where it might be, for people, for people who are used to a total separation between politics and aesthetics, which is the model that we have been given in this country, particularly through the Pound case, the actual Pound case, which is a complicated story that I write about in A Little History. There's a moment in Memory for Forgetfulness where Darwish talks about, as a child, I think he was 6. He was 6, born in 1942, 1948. He and his family left Albirwa, their village, their home village, and eventually ended up in Lebanon. And so there's a moment where he talks about going to Beirut as later on in life and taking a taxi and being asked to go directly to the place where he had been as a child. And he asked this question. He said, what was I looking for? Was I looking for Ithaca, or was I looking for the child I had been? And in the context of Palestinian nationalism, that is such a profound question, because it's a giving of permission for people to say, yeah, there is the national story, but I'm also a person. I went through this. I suffered this. I am this person who suffered this. And it opens up a floodgate of permission, and it's such a profound passage, and in many ways such a courageous passage. So that's I think one instance of interpreting something that might not be completely obvious as one is reading that. So yeah, I would leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ammiel, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks, Irene. Thanks, Elisa, and everybody for coming. Thank you.